What would be the optimal time of year for the election? Like summer, when people don't have like a million meetings or we're slower.
Oh, nice. That would be nice.
That would be very nice. Although at least here we can do it on campus.
I really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic high school.
We'll be showing, there was a PBS documentary called The Choice on Frontline. It's called The Choice, and it's supposed to be a objective really from people who knew that. And so we'll be showing that on Friday, kind of to, get people excited about, since it hopefully is, I think it was pretty objective. So that way, swayed, but
they both certainly have
learn about these candidates and who they are and why they think the way they do. So that's
So funny communities and
right.
Neither of them are perfect.
That's right. The last couple of weeks have been the most easiest.
and then okay, give me whatever's in reach. Oh, refrigerator, right away.
Oh, my ballot sat on my kitchen table for quite a while before I finally started eating it.
Right. All the students that were, that's what Carla said yesterday. I saw her after she voted. They were going back up this way. I'm done.
No, there was days where I was like, screw it, I'm not voting for either of these people. I thought about it, but...
It still contributes.
So attendees are students and also they probably better, yeah.
Students, staff, friends of honors, donors have been invited before.
How cool.
I can say
Great.
They have ramen restaurants.
Well, as I said, I love the students in college. They're so fancy ramen. It's like the first time I taught the honors, it was like intimidating. I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna up my game here.
They're okay to challenge you.
Yeah, they're not. You can't make anything up.
Right.
Like that's not true. You got me. They're good.
That's when you say, I was just making sure you were listening.
Exactly.
Making sure you read.
Some of those notes, like I remember the first day, I was like, what stuff do you guys interested in? How's free trade affected?
Okay, but what do you put in your own?
Air bill after sale bill. I'm like, oh my god.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like,
Exactly.
You got real
Yeah.
questions.
Dried fruit is
But
good.
that's good. It's not just surface level.
Cinnamon is a must. It's a must. Ooh, that's good too.
Surface level questions from
yeah, they
dig
know.
right into the nitty gritty.
That makes the food smell like
Thoughtful questions.
It's not bad.
For better or worse.
You
Yeah.
must come prepared, pretty much.
Yeah, so then mostly I teach like certification students, and then also seniors and juniors. I think I get the occasional like really ambitious sophomore who's usually her way into my class who's being smart, but generally juniors and seniors, and then and then my honors class is just juniors. It's juniors who are kind of the right age to their senior year.
Yeah.
So it's spring of their junior year, we do a class of like how to write and then the next year they start their senior year.
Yeah, really, we just surpassed our expectations of others out there in prosperity. That's a plus. Yeah, totally.
Open, I mean, when they come into class, it's only halfway through their junior year, so they've thought about it a little. Most of them know generally like the subfield, whether it might be like international relations or comparative politics or something, or they might know like they're interested in the continent of Africa, like they want to, they'll have some focus, but that's kind of the point of the class is to like really narrow down their focus through the semester. But I don't have any expectations. If you came to that class and was like, I don't know what the hell I want to do, I'd be like, welcome, no problem.
A lot of them were like, oh, okay. A lot of them were
Right.
going pretty much. A lot of them like
Yeah. Yes, I think it's great during that last last semester of junior year to start to figure out what you want to do. And the goal is that by the end of their junior year, they have like a written perspective, sort of like a plan for what they'll do. So it kind of gives them like a little semester, and then maybe start working for yourself. It just makes it so much less stressful than junior year. By the time the senior starts, they've already done so much. And senior years are already stressful already.
Yeah.
So last thing you need is like added stress.
Are you currently overseeing anyone?
This semester I actually have
Oh, yes, I did not remember that. Thank you for
Oh,
coming.
no, I'm in town. This is like exactly what I was curious about.
Okay, good.
So I'm not teaching, I'm not overseeing anything. No, but in the past I have overseen one is now at Stanford, two are at Columbia, lots of fancy grad schools. They're so good.
Oh, that's great.
I work with one honor student right now, he's my RA.
You go start here.
So, I work with him to sort of like, who is it? Even less.
Ring any bells?
Character you know. Don't forget she.
I know a couple of characters. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's
I think his advisor is not cool.
No, okay.
Graduate students or graduate kids do it.
Really?
Yeah.
I was gonna say.
How many faculty has
Yeah.
I believe it's about 25.
Why not?
Yeah.
But I'm just doing so much hiring, so maybe it's more.
No, you're fine.
It's kind of growing. Getting less traction.
We're hiring another year. No, Bill is still there, yep. He's very active, he still teaches.
Well, it's funny, even in their
Very
neighborhood,
much
they go
very
there.
great.
Relative to their own mission.
I have a couple of years coordinated the Fulbright scholarship process, and we haven't had him in a little while. I used to help with our interviews. He's always really good at
You
that.
live in Cornell,
Also
you
working
know.
for USAID.
That's why we lost.
So he was like mostly in DC, and it's very fun, he would live in DC, fly back one day a week. Oh my gosh, yeah. But now his room with USAID or whatever they call it over, so we get him back.
No, I like actually strategically bought candy. I didn't like for that reason.
And the Reds is still around.
Yeah, he's our director. I love Rams. He hired me, so I'm biased. And you're a genius.
Now I have candy.
It's very young department. We have like 10 faculty.
Wow.
Kind of what we were planning to do anyway. Because we're planning it out, planning it out,
Now it's just all
but on older people.
Just hold on to it.
Switch over to the tea.
I mean, it won't go bad, it'll just come to stay. Yeah, really.
Annika, I have she's 11, and I have been known, she has the stretch in the fall when I run, just for no reason, other than tripping over, well, she saw me
Just standing.
yeah,
I have no shame.
yeah, but it was out with my daughter on Saturday, and we were walking the dog, and she decided she wanted to run the last way.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah. So she totally messed up and we said her.
She cried.
No, she
Wow, what a jam.
I know. She was like,
No,
I'm fine.
Oh my god. Wow, I have a 1-year-old, and if you like blow on his head, he's gonna cry.
Super tough.
So dramatic.
Oh, like trying to fun things to look at. That was blow on her head.
It's a bit of a drama cake. So funny.
Wow.
So good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me back there? Yes, thumbs up, excellent. Welcome to the final Smart Talk of Fall 2016. My name is Kara Walter. I'm the Assistant Dean for Student Engagement here in the Honors College. And each semester we have this cool opportunity to hear from some of our best faculty on campus about research they're doing that is interesting to a wide audience. And every fall we pick speakers whose research in some way touches on the themes presented in our common reading that we give out to our first year students. This year, those of you who are first year students, and maybe others of you too, know that our common reading we gave out is Citizen. And Citizen touches on many different things, but the theme we focused on is identities and interactions. And so it's a pretty broad theme that we could really have lots of different faculty speak to that theme. I think our speaker for today is a dynamic and engaging researcher whose research interests couldn't really be more timely. We are, 1 week away from an election? I don't know if anybody had heard that. But that's coming up soon. And our speaker today has done some in-depth research on voting behavior and identities and how identities affect political attitudes and behavior. So I think that would be really interesting to turn the lens to our current election with some of those themes of her research. So she recently released a book called Independent Politics that she co-authored, and it was published this year, so very timely. Let me tell you a little bit more about her. Her name is Samara Klar, and she has been at the University of Arizona for how many years now?
Almost 4.
For almost 4 years. And she came here from Canada originally, right, as an undergraduate, and did her graduate studies in the U.S. Northwestern University is where she earned her PhD, and then made her way to the warmth and hospitality of Tucson and the University of Arizona. So we are really pleased that you're here, Dr. Klar, and we also want to welcome those of us who are participating today from afar, so our friends at UA South and anyone else who is checking into this presentation remotely. So having said that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Samara Klar.
Well, thank you so much for coming today and for learning a little bit more about my research. It is true that we have an election in just about a week, and my research tends to focus on how people behave in the real world. And what I mean when I say that is political science research tends to focus on respondents in very isolated, potentially not terribly realistic settings. You might be asked to fill out a survey by yourself. You might be asked to sit at a computer terminal in a lab and complete some surveys or participate in some experiments. So I try to broaden these settings and try to figure out how are people really thinking about politics when they're surrounded by others, when they're navigating among their competing identities. Now we know in political science that partisan identity, and that means your political identification, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, or potentially an independent, is really influential in how you shape your political preferences. So for example, partisan identities, identifying as a Democrat or a Republican, can influence your issue preferences. What I mean when I say that is if you are a Democrat, for the sake of argument, you tend to support Democratic policies even if you don't really understand what that policy means. If you are a Republican, you tend to support policies that the Republican Party supports even if you're not actually sure what the implications of that policy may be. That is what we find that across the aisle. Your partisan identification is really influential in your support for particular policies. Partisan identity impacts how you evaluate the economy. The economy is something you might think is really objective. Democrats tend to think the economy has done really well under President Obama. Republicans tend to think the economy has done terribly under President Obama. It is the same economy. We're looking at the same thing, but your partisan identification has a big influence over how you evaluate that. Partisan identification similarly influences the competence or blame that you attribute to parties. So who is at fault for the recession? Republicans will point to Democrats and Democrats will point to Republicans. Partisan identity even influences things that are factually objective. For example, the assessment of a candidate's skin color. Americans tend to think that politicians from their own party share their skin color. They tend to view candidates from the other party as having darker skin colors. We find that partisan identity influences all sorts of political information. But we experience partisanship in very complex settings. So we know that, for example, detachment from traditional social structures like the Catholic Church, like unions, has allowed Americans to have more shifting and more flexible identity formations. So people don't just identify as partisans anymore. They identify with all sorts of different groups. We know that modernization is drawing people into larger, more complicated networks of exchange. You are more likely to interact with people from all types of different socio-demographic groups. And in fact, that is potentially more true today than it was ever before. If you look simply at basic demographics, you can see that an all-time high percentage of marriages, 12% of marriages are now interracial. 39% of marriages are interfaith, that's an all-time high, so two individuals of different religions marrying each other. We know that 21% of American children speak a different language at home than they do at school. What this points to are a coming generation of Americans who identify with more identity groups than ever before. So in my work, I try to place partisanship in a more complex setting. Today I want to talk about the influence of social context. How does social context influence political attitudes and behaviors? I'm going to talk about 3 separate studies that I've worked on. I'm going to try to fit it all into this talk because I know the honor students here at Arizona can handle quite a lot of information, and I don't want to disappoint you. So we're going to talk about 3 separate studies. The first is a study I've done that looks at how the diversity of the people you talk about politics with can actually influence your preferences. I'm then going to turn to how the structure of your social network can influence how you form your partisan preferences. And then I'll conclude by referring to the book that I recently published on independent voters. And we'll look at how social norms in your environment can affect the degree to which you are willing to express your true partisan preferences. All right, so let's start with how social context might change how partisanship influences attitudes and behaviors. Here I'm going to look at the diversity of one's discussants. And what I find is that the influence of social settings can actually overwhelm the influence of your partisan identity. Now, there are 3 main outcomes of a concept political scientists refer to as partisan-motivated reasoning. Partisan-motivated reasoning means that we are motivated to align new information we receive with our pre-existing partisan preferences. So, for example, if I am a Republican and I learn that the unemployment rate has dropped, the percentage of people who are unemployed has dropped, I might justify that by saying, well, the percentage of people looking for a job has simply declined because people are taking themselves out of the workforce, and that is why we're seeing unemployment going down. So I'm trying to justify this information in a way that validates my Republican identity. Republicans and Democrats are equally likely to do this. We distort information in a way that confirms our pre-existing preferences. The 3 main outcomes of partisan-motivated reasoning are first, that partisans support the option endorsed by their preferred party regardless of the details, as I previously mentioned. The second outcome is that partisans perceive their own party solutions to be much more effective, and they perceive the other party solutions to be much less effective regardless of the details of those solutions. Third, we find that partisans are much more likely to seek out information that is congruent with their partisan beliefs. If you are a Democrat, you are more likely to watch MSNBC. If you are a Republican, you are more likely to watch Fox News. Because people like to hear the information that affirms what they already believe. And this leads to some really normatively problematic conclusions. So I'm going to quote Howard Levine here, who's a social psychologist at the University of Minnesota. He writes, partisan-motivated reasoning raises deeply troubling questions. How can an electorate possibly reward or punish an incumbent if it holds grossly distorted views of political conditions? How can we hold our candidates accountable if Democrats are unfairly assessing the Democratic Party more positively and Republicans are unfairly assessing the Republican Party more positively? Well, I argue that group settings should actually influence these dynamics. It is fair to say that in isolated settings, individuals engage in a lot of partisan-motivated reasoning, but there is reason to believe that our social settings might actually change that dynamic. First of all, ideologically homogeneous groups tend to confirm pre-existing beliefs, while diverse groups tend to weaken them. So, political scientists have already shown that like-minded groups, so groups where everyone agrees, tends to strengthen your pre-existing opinion. So if you tend to talk about politics with the people that agree with you, you are going to even strengthen further your political beliefs. If you tend to talk about politics with people that disagree, your views might become weaker. Diverse groups weaken pre-existing opinions by provoking you to consider both viewpoints. So I would expect that partisans, Democrats and Republicans, in homogeneous groups will engage in more partisan reasoning than partisans in heterogeneous groups would do. But we also know, there. I'm gonna have to use the computer for a second. We also know that social settings can influence even strong partisans. So even strong partisans are not immune to information from their political networks. Networks, and by that I mean the people with whom we discuss, will influence your vote choice. There we go. So this brings me to my second hypothesis. The influence of social settings is going to actually overshadow the strength of partisanship. So if you're a strong partisan in a diverse network, you should be actually less likely to engage in partisan motivated reasoning than if you're a weak partisan in an ideologically homogeneous network. So I want to tell you about how I conducted this particular experiment. I do mostly experimental work in my research, so I do experiments in the lab, I do experiments with surveys. This particular study is an experiment that I conducted in a laboratory. I designed an experiment that varied two factors, okay? So I first vary the ideological composition of an individual social setting. I want some of my respondents to be in homogeneous social groups, so discussion groups where everybody agrees with them. I want some of my discussants to not be in any group at all. I want them to consider political information all by themselves. And I finally want a third group to discuss politics in a diverse social group, where they're talking to both Democrats and to Republicans. The second factor that I want to manipulate is the strength of their partisanship. I want some of my respondents to hold really strong partisan attachments, and I want others to hold weaker partisan attachments. Now I expect that strong partisans overall will engage in more partisan motivated reasoning than will weak partisans. That is to say, they're going to be more biased in favor of their own party's information, their own party's policies. I would expect that individuals in homogeneous social groups, in which everyone agrees with them, will similarly engage in more partisan motivated reasoning than will individuals who are in diverse social settings. They will engage in much less partisan motivated reasoning. They will be less biased in favor of their own party. And finally, I expect that weak partisans in homogeneous groups will engage in more partisan motivated reasoning. They'll be more biased than even strong partisans in diverse groups. So it is the factor of the group, it is the social setting that will determine the level of bias that one employs when they're forming political preferences, not simply the strength of their partisan identity. So I did this with a bunch of students, actually. I conducted this experiment at Northwestern University, where I was completing my dissertation research. I had 367 student participants. I measured their partisan identity in an online survey 3 weeks before I called them into the lab. So I asked them all to fill out a survey, and I said, are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? Individuals who identified as independents were not included in this particular study. I then randomly assigned the 344 Democrats and Republicans into one of three group conditions. Some were in a homogeneous group of 8 Democrats, some were in a diverse group of 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and others were just in a no-group session. They were on their own without a group. You may ask why I do not have a homogeneous group of Republicans, and I will say that it's because I conducted this at Northwestern University. There's not a lot of Republicans there. Here I think I'd have much more success finding some ideological diversity. Each group arrived in the lab and followed the same procedure. So first, one group would arrive at a time, either a homogeneous group, a heterogeneous group, or a group that was told to not interact. They each then were randomly assigned to a partisan strength treatment at an individual computer terminal. So if an individual was assigned to be a strong partisan, they sat at their computer terminal and they were asked, what do you really hate about the other party? What do you like about your own party? When you ask somebody that, they strengthen the attachment to their own party, even temporarily. The weak partisans were simply asked to provide a few criticisms of their own preferred party. Everybody can criticize the party they prefer, and this tends to weaken your partisan attachment. After their partisan strength was manipulated, each participant read about both parties' solutions to 2 policy issues. The first issue was energy policy. They read about the advantages of drilling for oil, which was a Republican-endorsed policy, and they read about the advantages of using alternative fuels, which was a Democrat-endorsed policy. They then read about healthcare policy. They read about the Republican policy of increasing competition among private insurers, and then they read about the Democratic policy of increasing government subsidies for a nationalized health program. The homogeneous group and the heterogeneous group then gathered together as a group to discuss the issues together. They were given about 5 minutes to talk about the issues as a group. The non-social group did not engage in this step. They remained isolated at their computer terminals. After the discussion groups finished their discussion, everybody returned to their individual computer terminal, and they completed the rest of their anonymous survey, which measured their policy preference. It measured the perceived effectiveness of each party's policy, and it measured their desire to discuss this with the group again in the future. All right, so what do we find when it comes to policy preference? Each respondent was asked the following question: how should the government prioritize its energy policy efforts? The response scale ranged from only in alternative fuels, which was the Democratic policy, all the way down to only in drilling for oil, which was the Republican policy. And they could provide any answer here on the spectrum. Equally in drilling for oil and in alternative fuels was the midpoint. They were similarly asked about healthcare policy. How should the government prioritize its healthcare policy efforts? Here, the response scale ranged from only in expanding government subsidies, which is the Democratic-leaning policy, to only in increasing competition among insurers. All right, so I'm going to help you interpret this graph, because this is going to show you how each of my respondents, on average, responded to these questions. Let's take a look here on the left side. How should the government prioritize its energy policy efforts? Along this y-axis here, you can see only invest in alternative fuels as the highest point on the scale, and only invest in drilling for oil as the lowest. The strong partisans are indicated in dark blue. On average, strong partisans gave a response of 5.41, closer to only invest in alternative fuels, and the weak partisans were closer to the mix, 4.89. I want to keep in mind all of these respondents that I'm looking at here are Democrats. So what we're looking at are the strong Democrats and the weaker Democrats. So as existing literature would suggest, stronger Democrats support a more extreme policy view. If you look here at healthcare policy efforts, you can see again that these stronger Democrats are significantly closer to expanding subsidies, while the weaker Democrats are significantly closer to this equal mix of subsidies and competition. So as existing literature suggests, strong partisans are more likely to prefer more ideologically extreme preferences. Now let's take a look at what the group conditions did. If we look simply at the people who had no groups, they did not discuss the issue, their response to the energy policy was about 5.09, and their response to healthcare was 4.74. Individuals who were in diverse groups, so who were asked to discuss this issue with both Democrats and Republicans, significantly moved towards this bipartisan approach, an equal mix of both the Democrat and the Republican policies, whereas those Democrats who were in ideologically homogenous groups significantly became more extreme, moving closer toward the Democrat-only policy preference. So what we see here is the setting in which you were discussing issues is actually affecting your preferences. Now let's take a look at how strong partisans in diverse groups versus weak partisans in homogeneous groups behaved. Again, here we are seeing we're seeing weak partisans in homogeneous groups. So these are weak partisans who are discussing the issue only with other Democrats. And here we are seeing strong partisans who are discussing this issue in ideologically diverse settings. So even a strong partisan becomes more moderate, more open to bipartisan solutions when they are discussing policies in ideologically mixed groups. So what this suggests is that without taking social setting into account, strong partisans appear to engage in more biased, partisan-motivated reasoning than do weak partisans. But that is not how we discuss information in the real world. In the real world, we are in group settings, and these settings can actually reverse these effects. By discussing politics with people with whom we disagree, we can actually become much more moderate, much more bipartisan. Diverse groups change the way partisanship influences our preferences. So I now want to turn to how social context can change how partisanship influences our attitudes and our behaviors. I'm going to look here at the structure of your network. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about social network analysis, which might be a method that is interesting to some of you, certainly. What I find is that structurally diverse networks, and I'll define that term for you, enables access to novel information, and it facilitates persuasion. What you're looking at here is a map of Twitter conversations. These are individuals who are situated in homogeneous information environments. So Twitter data show two very distinct political clusters. This cluster over here is made up of 93% right-leaning users, so people who tend to be more Republican. This cluster, here's the right-leaning user here in red. And here we see a cluster of users who are 80% left-leaning. What Twitter data show us are what we call echo chambers. People on social media, as you probably experience in your own lives, tend to communicate mostly with people who agree with them. But we do not have full control over the information to which we are exposed. Now, political scientists show that people like to discuss politics with others that they agree with, but that's not always possible. Political information is conveyed in social settings, as I have been saying, and individuals do not always choose social settings for politically motivated reasons. You do not choose your classmates based on their political ideology. You do not choose your neighbors, your dorm mates, your roommates based on their political ideology. You end up in a lot of situations where the people around you do not agree with your politics. Political discussions tend to arise in very casual groups. It can happen on the bus, at the bus stop. It can happen when you're filling your car with gas. These are situations where you tend to be exposed to political information. Even online, politics can arise incidentally on message boards where politics wasn't the intended topic of discussion. Casual acquaintances like this enable exposure to novel information. It is through what network scientists call weak ties that we are able to access new information. A weak tie is an individual that is less socially involved with one another than our friends. So our friends tend to know each other, they are strong ties. Your contacts who do not know each other are your weak ties. If you can think of someone that you know in your life, on Facebook, on Twitter, someone you speak to who does not know very many other people that you know, that is a weak tie. If you think of someone who tends to know all the same people you do, that is a strong tie. It is through our weak ties that we acquire exposure to dissimilar views. So access to weak ties should affect the information we see. We know that weak ties connect individuals to disparate regions of a broader social network. These are areas we cannot access without our weak ties. Have you ever heard a piece of gossip from a friend, and then you heard it from another friend, and then you think you heard it twice, but it turns out both those friends got it from the same source? So you're hearing it multiple times from different people, but it's all coming from the same source. That is a strong tie. A weak tie, however, is going to give you information that you are not going to access otherwise. So you can expect that when the structure of your network enables access to weak ties, you should be exposed to a diverse range of perspectives. We also know that exposure to opposing viewpoints, as I just suggested in my previous study, actually increases our ability to justify the opposing argument. It increases our ability to learn about the opposing argument. So exposure to weak ties can actually increase the amount that we learn and the amount that we engage with a particular issue. So my second hypothesis in this particular study is that individuals whose contacts reach distant regions of a network should be more likely to learn about new perspectives. Finally, we know that diverse social settings promote even-handed considerations. So my third hypothesis is that people who have access to different views, whose social networks allow them to access different views, should form opinions that better reflect those views. All right, so I conducted this study with an online sample of adults. This one was not done with students. I first sent out an initial survey in which I asked adults if they would participate in an online social network. They completed a profile page. They gave me their demographic information. I paid them $2.50. It's a pretty straightforward interaction. They then had to participate in this social network, a social network that my co-author and I had actually created, for 10 days. Each respondent was assigned to a different type of network, which I'll show you in just a second, and each respondent was assigned to 6 other people in the study as a network. So everybody in the network had 6 contacts, and they were each in a particular type of a network. This lasted for 10 days. After 10 days, I asked every respondent to give me their opinions on issues that had come up through the interactions among the networks. At that point, I paid them $17.50, so that's a big cash out. They got $20 for this particular study. All right, so this is what my 2 networks look like. This kind of looks like maybe like a biology class or something. But what this is here we have, these are exact replicas of what our network looked like. Each little dot here represents an individual who participated, and each link represents their connection. So this person is connected to 6 different people, and those 6 people tend to be clustered right around them. This person is similarly connected to 6 people, but their 6 connections are at different parts of the network. So here, the connections are all clustered, tightly clustered around each node. Here, the connections are more randomly dispersed across the network. This is a more clustered network. This is called a clustered lattice. In a clustered lattice, your connections are very likely to know each other. This is called a random network. In this kind of a network, you are connected to all sorts of different people who don't know each other. This person here is connected to this guy and this guy, but they're not connected to each other. Here, everyone's connections tend to be tightly connected to one another. We then seeded different pieces of information in each network. What we wanted to see in this particular study is does this more random network enable access to underrepresented views? So in each network, we seeded 2 pieces of information 3 times. One piece of information was seeded twice, indicated by the red dot, and one piece of information was seeded just 1 time. What we want to know is what is the likelihood that people in this network will have access to this underrepresented viewpoint as compared with people in this network. Now I'll show you what the news and what the items looked like. The news items included arguments in favor and against 2 issues that were in the news at the time. One was electric cars and the other is genetically modified organisms. So each respondent here had access to an article in favor of buying an electric car and an article against buying an electric car. Oh, sorry. Switch this again. Sometimes these batteries like to be taken out and put back in for some reason. No, okay.
Try over here.
The news items also included arguments in favor and against GMOs, and these were videos. Did I turn this off potentially? No? Okay. Thanks. I can just carry that with me and stand here if that's easier.
I think it's this thing on the side.
Oh, is that it? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. When a participant in the network viewed a piece of information, his or her contacts received an email alerting them to the fact that they had viewed that information. And this is what the email looked like. Our social network was called Political Pulse, and it would say, today is November 22nd, your connections have been reading the latest items, take a look at what's out there. Andrew saw electric cars are a smart investment. Andrew saw GMOs must go. Jacqueline David saw electric cars don't get taken for a ride. Links in the emails pointed participants to a web page where they could then view the information that was sent. And we were able to track exactly who saw which piece of information when by using distinct ID codes in the URL. So by using this particular trick in the URL, we can see exactly who saw what and when. We can then analyze the diffusion of the information, so how quickly this information travels through the network, as well as the effect of the information by then surveying our respondents about their attitudes. What we first found is the clustered lattice, the network in which all your friends tend to know each other, promoted one viewpoint only, the viewpoint that had been seeded twice, whereas the random network equalized exposure to both sides. So if you look here at the left side of the screen, you can see what happened in the high clustered lattice network. On day 1, people were twice as likely to see the piece of information that had been seeded twice as often, and that exacerbated over time. By the end of the study, people were more than 4 times as likely to see the anti-electric car information as they were the pro-electric car. In the network in which individuals' contacts were not connected to each other, the pieces of information diffused at almost exactly the same rate. So by the end of the study, people were just as likely to see both the more popular information and the less represented information. We saw the exact same thing with our second piece of information about genetically modified organisms. You can see how the 2 seeds were far more likely to be seen than the 1 seed in the high clustered network, and they were just as likely to be seen in our random network, the less clustered network. So when an individual's contacts tend to know each other, we see that redundant information travels through the network and it increases exposure to dominant perspectives. When an individual's contacts connect to different parts of the network, increased exposure enables exposure to underrepresented views. So what does this mean for preference formation? Should I do it again? Yes. We surveyed our participants 2 days after the study ended, and we could ask them, did you learn new information about these issues? Do you support or oppose genetically modified organisms and electric cars? What we found is that individuals in the clustered lattice, whose connections tend to know each other, learned significantly less information and became less supportive of the underrepresented view. This increased their support for the underrepresented perspective. So less clustered networks, where your friends tend to know different types of people, increase your support for underrepresented viewpoints. When an individual encounters underrepresented perspectives, he then moderates his opinion. Second. There we go. So this has implications for how we understand individual preferences and how we understand information campaigns. Information campaigns are asymmetric. So for example, in 2012, averaging across all states, 77% of ads came from one party. This year has actually been even more dramatic in terms of the imbalance between exposure to Democratic and Republican advertising. In only 7 states were campaign resources split at least as equitably as 40-60. We know that individuals in less clustered networks are better exposed to a diverse balance of information, and this can change how we form our partisan preferences. So I'm going to conclude by showing a little bit of evidence on how the social norms in our social settings, tend to affect our willingness to then express these partisan preferences. I find that social desirability bias discourages Americans from publicly identifying with a party under certain conditions. Individuals like to make a good impression. We know that is true. This is basic sociology. If anyone had to read Erving Goffman like I did in college, we know that people want to present themselves in ways that are pleasing to others, and people are likely to behave in ways that others will view positively. Some examples include when you're filling out a survey, even an anonymous survey where you're not providing your name and you know no one's ever going to know you were the person who took the survey, you are still not going to admit to that one time that you shoplifted. You are not going to admit that you hold discriminatory attitudes. You are not going to admit that you didn't vote. People will lie about voting in surveys. It is that bad. If you ask a survey of Americans, did you vote? Like 90% of them said they did. That's just not possible. It even works with candidate choice. If there's a socially undesirable candidate, people are much less likely to admit that they support that candidate. Partisanship, identifying as a Democrat or a Republican, is particularly socially undesirable these days. We know that American media cover the news, especially partisan politics, in a disproportionately negative light. We know that we have reached an unprecedented level of vitriol in American politics. We even see with a content analysis that some of my students conducted, the percentage of phrases in political rhetoric over time has become increasingly negative. So we would expect the desirability of political independence is now a phenomenon in American politics. Americans are much more likely to say they are politically independent in order to portray a good impression. We would expect that the more that people are exposed to negative information, the more likely they are to say that they are in fact politically independent. We expect that people who are more susceptible to social desirability pressures are also more likely to identify as independent. And finally, I will prove with a series of experimental studies that this is in fact the case. Here we used a nationally representative sample of 800 adults. We conducted this experiment in February of 2013. I'll tell you in a second why that's relevant. Before the procedure, we measured something that psychologists call self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is a psychological trait that measures the degree to which you are susceptible to social desirability pressures. A high self-monitor is attuned to the social norms in the room around them, and they're more likely to change what they say and what they do in order to conform to those norms. A low self-monitor is also aware of the norms, but really doesn't care, and they're just going to say whatever they want to say. So you probably know already whether you're a high self-monitor or a low self-monitor. But we can measure whether or not you are a high or low self-monitor with a series of survey questions. To what extent do you agree with these statements? In a group, I like to be the center of attention. High self-monitors are going to be closer to a yes, low self-monitors are closer to a no. I'm always courteous, no matter how unpleasant someone else might be. That's a high self-monitor. I would make a very good actor. Actors are high self-monitors. So we can tell whether a sample is high or low in self-monitoring. After measuring self-monitoring, we randomly assigned respondents to read a news article. The first article was about partisan unity in Washington, so parties agreeing. The second was about partisan disagreement, partisans fighting in Washington. And the third, it was February, we needed a control group, we needed people to read about something that had nothing to do with politics. They read about the origins of Groundhog Day. We then ended this survey by measuring their party identification, and we asked them for their issue position. So what we found is that among high self-monitors, those who read about Groundhog Day were about 15% of them were independent. About 14% who read about partisan unity were independent, but 30% of Americans, high self-monitors who read about partisan disagreement, all of a sudden say they're independent. Among low self-monitors, we find no effect at all. So it is only among high self-monitors that partisan news about disagreement encourages them to identify as independent. High but not low self-monitors identify as independent after reading about partisan disagreement, but they do not change their issue preferences. They are only changing the degree to which they portray an independent image. Overall, we find that American politics makes partisanship undesirable. Americans view independence as making the best impression. Reminders of partisan disagreement exacerbate this effect, and those who are most susceptible to self-monitoring are most likely to identify as independent. So what does this mean for behaviors? This is the last study that I'm going to present today, and I actually conducted this one with one of my classes 2 years ago here in Arizona. So my students conducted this experiment. They were super, super smart students. All right, did the desirability of independence decrease public displays of partisanship? My students walked around Tucson, Arizona, and they handed out surveys to the adults that they found on the street, downtown, around campus. These surveys began with one of the following two phrases. The first was, the 2016 presidential election is almost 3 years away. The second survey began with this sentence. The 2016 presidential election is almost 3 years away, but both the Democrats and Republicans have already started to launch aggressive attacks against one another. So reminding people about disagreement in politics. Respondents completed a brief survey which included self-monitoring, so we know the highs and the lows. And as a thank you token, they were then offered a choice of 3 stickers. The pollsters, who were all students in my class, this is 409, my opinion class, noted which sticker the individual took and whether he or she displayed the sticker. These are the stickers. They could take this, they were all in color. This is just a photographed copy of what they looked like. This was the Democratic sticker, there was a Republican sticker, and there was an eagle sticker, which is like this non-partisan animal, I guess. All right, the question is, will high self-monitors exposed to disagreement be less likely to display a partisan sticker? These are our low self-monitors, so people who do not conform to the social norms around them. We show no difference. Whether or not they read the control phrase or the disagreement phase, they're equally likely to display a partisan sticker. However, if you look at our high self-monitors, about 60% of high self-monitors who read the control phrase take a sticker. This almost halves among those who read about party disagreement. What this suggests is that partisan disagreement discourages public displays of partisanship. So we did all sorts of additional studies on this one. We looked at the degree to which people will put up yard signs, talk about politics, or even join online forum to discuss politics. Essentially, what we know to be true is that social norms in our political environment, particularly social norms featuring partisan disagreement, some of which you may be familiar with in our existing election, are actually discouraging people from displaying partisan signs. They are silencing what political scientists call the political voice. Parties care that you go out and vote. They also care that you talk about your vote with your friends, you talk about your preferred candidate, you wear the sticker, you put up the sign. Existing social norms are actually silencing those behaviors. So my work tends to place partisan and social identities into a broader context to understand their implications. So I tend to look at intersections within voting blocks. I find that LGBT Americans, for example, who identify with all sorts of different types of groups are much less likely to engage with politics. I look at how self-monitoring, the psychological trait we just discussed, actually affects the degree to which individuals sort into competing parties. High self-monitors are more likely to identify as Democrats if their friends do. Low self-monitors are more likely to identify as Democrats if they are truly liberal. And the same goes for Republicans and conservatives. And finally, I've been looking at how sharing a common identity in certain cases unites parties, unites Democrats, Republicans, and in other cases pushes them further apart. Particular example, I've been looking at our female Democrats and female Republicans who show a really unusually high level of antagonism compared with men from either party and opposite gender relationships from either party. So I'm going to now turn to any questions that you may have. If I can scroll again, there you go. I would like to conclude by reminding you that preference formation is occurring in the context of a diversifying society. I find that multiple identities and diverse social settings change how we form our political preferences. So incorporating these constructs allows us to better understand the complexion of citizen preferences as well as the responsiveness of the government to our preferences. All right, any questions? Yes?
I was actually curious, in the first experiment that you discussed, I
Yes.
think the one at Northwestern, where you said you had a lack of Republican experimentees?
Yes.
Victims?
What way do I look at it?
Were there any methods you used to account for that, to make certain that your candidates or your subjects
Yeah, sure.
were actually moving towards the center and not just towards the other extreme?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, given that the subjects in the first experiment, so just to remind everyone, because it may have been a while ago, I had individuals in ideologically homogeneous groups that were all Democrats or diverse groups that were a mix of Democrats and Republicans. So in my analysis, I only look at the Democrats' response. So that would help me. So if I were to look at everybody's response, then it wouldn't really be clear the direction that they were moving in, because the Republicans might be moving left and the Democrats would be moving right. So I only look at the Democrats. So that explains why in the homogeneous conditions, everyone moves toward the Democratic side, and in the diverse conditions, everyone moves toward a more moderate position. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I've been hearing and reading about a lot of movement or discussion, at least, toward the creation of a third party, and there's always talk of that, probably every election cycle, but ramped up even more so with the extreme partisanship on display this time around. So do you think that's something that can get traction, and are these people who are independents, is there something that unites them that would attract them to a different party?
Sure, so the question was, given that there is this social norm in favor of identifying as an independent, is it possible for a third party to succeed? I think that it's a question I've really spent a lot of time thinking about, to be honest with you. If there were an election where a third party could succeed, I think this would have been the election. Both parties are really disliked, both candidates are really disliked. There's real social desirability against both parties. We have a plurality of Americans now who identify as independent, 45% of Americans, more than Democrats or Republicans. There are more independents than either Democrats or Republicans in the United States. In Arizona, it oscillates between Republicans and independents. So for a long period of time, over the past few years, Arizona had a plurality of independents, but Republicans just recently inched up again. Having said that, no, I don't think a third party is going to succeed, and that's for a psychological reason and also a structural reason. The psychological reason is that party identification is really powerful, and independents tend to vote for the same party every single year. Over 90% of independents, so people who identify as independent, have only voted for one party their whole life. And you will hear this a lot. I'm an independent, but I would never vote Republican. People always say that. I'm an independent, but I hate the Democrats. So they say they're an independent. They feel like an independent, but they would never in their life vote for one particular party. What this means is that electorally, independents behave just like partisans, but out in the real world, when it comes to canvassing, volunteering, wearing signs, they act they're very disengaged. But it does not mean that they're actually going to support a third party. I think one of the structural reasons it's so hard is because Americans really hate the idea of throwing away their vote. They want to vote for somebody who might actually win, and it's really hard for a third party to win in a two-party system. I think Bernie Sanders faced that obstacle quite a lot. He really had to be seen as electable, and I think he actually managed to overcome that. He was seen as electable by the end of the primary season. But it's really, really difficult for a third party to do that, given the attachment people have, the habitual voting. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you see a solution to the increase in partisanship among the populace?
So more partisanship?
Yeah, or to make, I don't know, to create a more moderate situation?
Yeah, so, this whole book that I wrote this year is all about how the extreme rhetoric in the party system is driving masses of Americans away from the party system and identify as independents and not working for the parties. So the obvious question is, well, why doesn't the party system stop doing that and start bringing independence back? I think that there's, again, maybe two things that are holding it back. First, the primary system is structured in a way that really tends to reward more ideologically extreme candidates, particularly in places where independents are not allowed to vote in the primary system. So I think that is one particular reason that it's hard. It is to candidates' benefit to be ideologically extreme in the primary system. Then, of course, the general election rolls around, and nobody likes any of the candidates because they're both too extreme. So I think that's one of the problems. The second problem is, primary system aside, there is a real short-term gain in an election for a party to rally its extremist base. The extreme voters, ideologically extreme voters, are much more likely to turn out, and they're much more likely to volunteer. So there's short-term benefit for parties to engage in really harsh rhetoric. There's huge long-term losses, though. So I think it would actually have to take a party's willingness to give up one election in order to attract more voters several years down the line, and that's really hard to do. I think this year it could certainly happen for the Republicans. Although the Republicans actually, after Mitt Romney lost, sort of made this concerted effort to become more moderate. And that didn't really work, so I don't know what's going to happen this year. But any other questions? Yes?
If there are students who might have some interest in your research and learning more about how they could get involved, what would you recommend?
Well, I actually do a lot of research with my students. So that study you saw with the stickers, that was done with, it was actually my students' idea to use stickers. That wasn't an honors class, that was just a super smart group of students. So I really like to incorporate students into my research, both, I said that was 409, but I think that was actually 301, I don't remember anymore. I do it in all of my classes. So yeah, in my classes I like to do that, and then I also work with a lot of students working on their own stuff. So yes, I love that. I love when students enroll in my classes, and then we get to work on stuff and publish papers and things like that. So I actually have a paper coming out in just a couple of weeks, probably. The publishing process is so slow, but that was co-authored with a student who did an independent study with me. And she did this really, really cool survey of LGBT Americans within Pima County. And then together we kind of worked on it a little bit, and that will be published probably before the end of the year, I think. Yeah.
Do you have time to stick around?
Oh yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Well, that was very interesting to me, very engaging, and if you all have any follow-up you'd like to do with Dr. Klar before she finishes her lunch, come on up and chat with her. Thanks for coming. You what? Oh, that's fine. I don't have to. I'll be recorded. Just so you know. Big brother is watching. Oh, nice. And it actually helps me. I was thinking about it. Well, I don't though. I actually hate split screen.
I did that this year, actually.
Yeah, I hate it. I was a builder too. But I think, gosh, how long have I been registered? Yeah. Ever since I've been registered, I've been registered.
Oh, yeah.
It's been like 20 years.
Well, my sister when I first moved here, he was like, if I said you're independent, can I have a vote? Oh, yeah, you totally can. You're good. He was like, great. Thank you for that.